Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going deep into UK constitutional law.
Oh yeah, this will be good.
It's fascinating stuff and kind of unique.
It really is. Most countries don't do things the way the UK does.
Exactly. We'll be looking at excerpts from Introduction to UK Constitutional and Administrative Law to guide our deep dive.
Sounds good.
So get ready to untangle the UK Constitution and see what works, what maybe doesn't, the pros and cons.
I'm excited to get into it. The UK system really is a fascinating anomaly. It's globally unique.
Yeah, it seems that way. But before we get too specific about the UK, let's talk about constitutions in general.
Okay.
What even is a constitution? Sounds simple, but
Yeah, it's way more complex than it sounds. You've got folks like Bradley and Ewing, classic legal scholars, and they focus on the document, like a formal written thing.
right, picture it in a museum.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then you have thinkers like Bolingbroke, and he's all about the system, the whole system of governance laws, institutions, customs, everything that makes a country tick.
So it's more than just a piece of paper, it's how the country actually works.
Exactly. It's about how the sausage gets made, so to speak.
Love that analogy. And speaking of how things work, there's a great quote from Tom Paine's Rights of Man that really gets at this idea.
Oh yeah, Tom Paine, always a good time. What's the quote?
He says, "A constitution is a thing antecedent to a government, and a government is only the creature of a constitution. The constitution of a country is not the act of its government, but of the people constituting a government."
Powerful stuff. The people create the Constitution, and then the government comes from that. It's
Yeah.
the foundation.
Exactly. So whether a constitution's written down all fancy or not,
Right.
there are some key elements it has to deal with.
Absolutely. The core stuff.
What are those elements? What should we be looking for?
Well, first off, any constitution defines the institutions of government. Like who's in charge, what do they do, how do they all relate to each other? It's like the country's organizational chart.
Makes sense. Keeps everyone on the same page.
Then there's the whole distribution of powers. Who gets to do what?
Right. So we're talking legislative, executive, judicial branches, that sort of thing.
Bingo. That's how you stop any one part of the government from getting too powerful. Balance,
Checks and balances, class.
And then a constitution will also define how those powers are actually used
yeah,
and how they're controlled. This is where we get into checks and balances.
super important, especially to prevent one branch from having too much power. We see this in the U.S. all the time.
All the time. And last but not least, any constitution needs to address the relationship between the government and the citizens. Fundamental rights, responsibilities, limits on what the government can do. It's that whole social contract idea,
Okay, so the Constitution lays out how the whole country functions. It's the blueprint.
pretty much.
And now here's where it gets really interesting. The UK. Well, they don't have a single written constitution like a lot of other countries.
Nope, they don't. It's what we call an unwritten constitution, or, to be more accurate, uncodified.
So no fancy document under glass.
Instead, their constitutional principles are spread out across different sources. You've got statutes, case law, conventions, even just historical practices that have developed over time.
Wow, that sounds like a lot to keep track of. How do constitutional experts even begin to understand all of that?
Honestly, it's a challenge. Imagine trying to make sense of the U.S. system, but instead of having the Constitution, you just had random laws, court decisions, etiquette manuals from the past 300 years.
That sounds incredibly difficult and confusing.
Yeah, pretty much. Putting all those pieces together, making it make sense, that's literally what constitutional law textbook writers in the UK do. It's their job.
So it's like a giant historical jigsaw puzzle. Amazing, but also really complex.
For sure.
So what are the pros and cons of this whole unwritten thing?
Well, it comes down to a big debate. Flexibility versus clarity. Let's start with the good stuff. The UK is a perfect example of how this flexibility lets them adapt to new situations. They can evolve with the times. Think about how they got rid of the death penalty. No huge constitutional crisis. Their system just sort of adapted organically.
So it's like a living, breathing document, always changing.
Kinda. But of course there are downsides too. One of the biggies is that lack of clarity. For everyday people, it's harder to know what your rights are, what the government can and can't do. It's all spread out.
Right, and without that one central document.
It's harder to build that strong sense of national identity. Like in the U.S., you have that shared reverence for the Constitution. It's a symbol.
Okay, I see that. So what about written constitutions then? What are the advantages of having it all spelled out?
Well, a good written constitution is clear, Easy to understand. Anyone can pick it up and see what's what. It lays out your rights and how those rights are protected, and it sets limits on the government's power.
So it's a safeguard against tyranny, right? Clear boundaries for everyone.
Exactly. And it can be a really powerful unifier, too. Like I said, think about the U.S. Constitution. People see it as a symbol of unity, of shared values. There's a reason it's treated with so much respect.
I can see that. So written constitutions have a lot going for them, but then why does the UK do things so differently?
Well, because there are downsides to having everything set in stone, too. One big criticism is that written constitutions can be too rigid. Changing them can be super difficult.
Right. You often need these supermajorities and votes or even whole referendums.
Exactly. Which is great for preventing rash decisions. But what if the world changes and the Constitution needs to change too?
It's like a straitjacket. All that clarity and stability can backfire.
A classic example is the U.S. Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. Back in the 18th century, totally made sense. Citizen militias were vital. But now,
Now it's a whole different world, and it's incredibly difficult to change the Constitution to reflect that.
exactly, it's that trade-off. Clarity and stability on one hand, flexibility and adaptability on the other.
But that's something to think about. Would you rather have a system that's clear but rigid, or flexible but maybe a bit confusing?
It's a tough question, and there's no one right answer. Every country's got to figure out what works best for them. Their history, their culture, their political situation, it's all got to factor in.
Makes sense. So let's bring it back to the UK. How's their system, with all its quirks, actually worked out in practice?
That's the million-dollar question. To really understand that, we need to get into some specific examples of how this unwritten constitution plays out in the real world.
Sounds good to me.
And that's exactly what we'll do after. Well, we're not really taking a break, but let's dive deeper next.
Let's do it.
So before we went on to more examples,
Yeah.
we were talking about how the UK's unwritten constitution has its good and bad points.
Totally. It's flexible, which is cool, but also, like, how do you even know what the Constitution says?
Right. It can be super unclear, even for someone like me who studies this stuff.
Exactly. It's like trying to find your way around a city with no map.
Oh, totally. And that makes it tricky,
Yeah.
Like, how do we even know which principles are, like, truly constitutional, the bedrock stuff, as opposed to just laws or political habits, things that could change easily?
Yeah, that's a good point. Is there like a secret decoder ring or something? How can you tell the difference?
Huh. If only. No, but there are some things we can look for. First off, truly constitutional principles. They deal with the big stuff, like the structure of the government, what each branch can do, the relationship between the government and the people. It's the system's mainframe.
Okay, so the core building blocks of the UK's political setup.
Right. And another thing, these principles are super hard to change. Remember we talked about how entrenched the U.S. Constitution is?
Yeah.
It's kind of similar in the UK, just without that formal amendment process. Constitutional principles there, they've developed over centuries. Big historical events, power shifts, it's serious stuff, not easily overturned.
They've really stood the test of time. Shows a deep agreement on how things should work in the UK.
Exactly. Ready for some examples of these tricky constitutional principles in action?
Absolutely. Hit me.
Okay, so one of the most basic, and one that people talk about all the time, is parliamentary sovereignty.
Ah, yes.
This means that Parliament, so that's the House of Commons and the House of Lords together,
Right.
they're the top dogs when it comes to making laws. What they say goes.
That sounds super powerful, but hold on. Doesn't that, like, totally contradict the idea that the UK has an unwritten constitution? If Parliament's supreme, can't they just, like, make up any rules they want?
That's the thing. It's a really great question, and it gets right to the heart of what's so unique about how the UK system works. See, even though there's no single document that limits what Parliament can do, their actions are still constrained. Centuries of legal precedent, political norms, public expectations all play a role.
So it's like
Yeah.
there's this web of invisible constraints, shaped by history, tradition, all this stuff that's not actually written down anywhere, but it's still super important.
You got it. And those constraints, they're powerful. They create a system of checks and balances, even without a formal document spelling it all out.
Okay, so parliamentary sovereignty is one of the big ones. What are some other key principles at play in the UK?
Another huge GE one is the rule of law.
Right. Rule of law.
Classic.
Basically, this means that everyone, even the government, has to follow the law. No one's above it. Everyone gets a fair trial, due process, the good stuff. It's a cornerstone of any democracy.
So even without a single document listing out all the rights, The UK system still has built-in ways to protect individuals and their freedoms.
That's right. And these principles often, like, overlap in really interesting ways.
Oh, I bet.
So, yeah, Parliament's sovereign, right.
Yeah.
But they can't just pass any old law they want if it breaks the rule of law.
The courts have the power to step in and interpret things. Make sure that the laws actually do line up with those fundamental principles. It's called judicial review.
Right, judicial review. That rings a bell. Can you remind us what that is, again, in the UK system?
Sure, it's basically the courts checking up on Parliament and the government.
Right.
They get to look at a law that Parliament passed or something the government did, and they decide, is this cool with the UK's basic constitutional principles? Or is it a no-go?
Okay, so if a court says, nope, this law doesn't fit with our core principles, what happens then? Can they just, like, get rid of the law?
Not exactly. They can't strike it down directly like they sometimes can in the U.S. system.
Right, different systems.
But what they can do is issue a declaration of incompatibility.
Okay, and what does that mean?
Basically, they're saying to Parliament, hey, this law, it's not playing nice with our fundamental values. You might want to rethink this.
So it's a way of putting pressure on Parliament to change things, even if they can't force them to.
Right. It's this delicate balance. The courts respecting that Parliament gets to make the laws, but also making sure those laws don't go against the rule of law or people's rights. Super interesting stuff.
I can see how that would get complicated. Any real-life examples of this in action?
Oh, tons.
Oh, good.
But, like, one that's super recent and everyone knows about. Brexit.
Oh, yeah.
The UK leaving the EU. That whole thing threw up a bunch of tricky constitutional questions, like, did the government need Parliament's okay before they started the process of leaving? Or could they just go ahead and do it on their own?
Wow, yeah, I bet that caused a lot of debate. What happened? Who got the final say?
Well, the Supreme Court had to weigh in, and they said, nope, the government can't just bypass Parliament on something this big. They needed Parliament's approval.
So that was a big win for parliamentary sovereignty then.
It was. But it also showed how, even in an unwritten system, there are limits on what the executive branch can do. They're not all powerful.
Fascinating stuff. So courts have a big role to play in figuring out how the UK's unwritten constitution works. But what about the people? Do they have any power in all of this?
Oh, absolutely. Public opinion matters. Just like in any democracy, political pressure is a powerful force in the UK. Remember those constitutional conventions we talked about before? The unwritten rules that guide how politicians act?
Mm-hmm.
Well, those conventions, they're shaped a lot by what the public expects from its leaders.
Right. If people are unhappy, politicians have to listen.
Exactly. So even without a document that says, here are your rights, people, the UK system still has ways to hold the government accountable and make sure they're paying attention to what the people want. It's about more than just words on a page.
I like that. It's about trust and a shared commitment to those core values. But what happens when that trust breaks down? What if people disagree about what those principles actually mean or how they apply in real life?
Yeah. Now we're getting into the really tricky stuff.
I'm ready. So we're back, and we're ready to tackle the really tough stuff.
Oh, yeah. This is where it gets interesting. We were talking about those disagreements, right? When people don't agree on what constitutional principles actually mean or how they should play out in the real world.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's great to have big ideas like parliamentary sovereignty or the rule of law, but who actually decides what they mean in practice? Is there a, like, constitutional referee somewhere, someone everyone agrees to listen to?
You'd think so, right?
Right.
But nope, that's not how it works in the UK. There's no single ultimate authority. It's more like all these different players have to work together to figure things out. The government, Parliament, the courts, even public opinion comes into play. It's a balancing act.
So it's not like a rule book you can just look up. It's more like a constant back and forth negotiation.
That's a great way to put it. It's a very British way of doing things, really. Evolved over time, you know. So let's start with Parliament. They're sovereign, right? Like we discussed before. They have the final say on making laws.
Yeah, that's the idea. But those laws are still subject to judicial review, aren't they?
There it is. Judicial review. That's where the courts get to step in.
Can you remind us how that works in the UK system?
Sure. Basically, the courts can look at a law Parliament made or something the government did.
Right.
And they ask, hang on, is this actually okay? Does it fit with the UK's big constitutional principles? Or is it off base?
So if a court decides that, yeah, a law doesn't really match up with those principles, what happens then? Can they just toss it out?
Not quite. It's not like in the US where they can just strike down a law,
Right, right. Different systems.
but they can issue something called a declaration of incompatibility, basically a big red flag.
Ooh, what's that all about? Sounds serious.
It is. It's the court saying to Parliament, hey, we think this law you made, it's not really in line with our core values. You might want to take another look at this.
So they can't force Parliament to change the law, but they can definitely put on the pressure.
Exactly. It's all about balance, right? The courts are respecting that Parliament gets to make the laws, but they're also making sure those laws don't mess with fundamental stuff like the rule of law or individual rights. It's a pretty fascinating process.
Definitely seems like it. Any good real-world examples of this happening?
Oh, tons. But one that's super recent and everyone's heard of.
Oh, tell me.
Brexit. The UK leaving the European Union.
Brexit.
That whole thing threw up all sorts of crazy constitutional questions.
I bet.
Like one of the big ones was, does the government need Parliament's say-so before they start the process of leaving the EU? Or can they just do it on their own?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I can see how that would be a massive issue. So what happened? Who ended up calling the shots?
The Supreme Court got involved,
Mm-hmm.
and they ultimately decided, nope, the government can't just go around Parliament on something this huge. They said Parliament had to be on board.
So that was a pretty big win for the idea of parliamentary sovereignty then.
Yep. But it also showed that even in this unwritten system, even with parliamentary sovereignty, the executive branch isn't all-powerful. There are still limits on what they can do. Checks and balances.
Fascinating. So courts have a big part to play in figuring out this unwritten constitution. But what about the people? Where do they fit in?
Oh, they're definitely a part of it. Public opinion, political pressure, those things matter a lot in the UK, same as any democracy. Remember those constitutional conventions we talked about?
Oh,
The unwritten rules?
Yeah, I remember.
Well, those are massively shaped by what the people expect from their leaders.
Right. If the people aren't happy, politicians have got to pay attention.
You got it.
Yeah.
So even though there's no document specifically saying, here are your rights, people, the UK system still has ways to make sure the government's listening and that they're doing right by the people.
I like that. So it's not just about what's written down, it's about shared understanding, a commitment to those core values, even if they're not all spelled out in black and white.
Exactly. And that's really what makes any constitution work, whether it's written or unwritten. It's a deeper level of agreement on how power should be used and everyone being committed to making it work. That's the key.
It's been so interesting diving into this with you. Really makes you think.
Glad you enjoyed it. It's a fascinating system.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, I think the biggest takeaway is just how complex and dynamic the UK system really is. It might not always be neat and tidy, but it's evolved over centuries to balance different sources of power and protect individual freedoms, uphold the rule of law. It's impressive, really. It's like a constantly changing puzzle, always adding new pieces, rearranging the old ones. We've seen the pros and cons of both written and unwritten constitutions, and it's definitely given us all a lot to consider.
It has.
So, as we wrap up, here's a final thought for everyone listening. Could the U.S. system, with its focus on that one written document, could it actually benefit from a little bit of the UK's flexibility? Or would that risk messing up the clarity and stability that the U.S. Constitution provides? It's something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of UK constitutional law.
Thanks for having me.